And I also want to just say for the video that like I was having weird color issues, so I put on a filter and now I'm in old-timey mode, but at least I'm visible.
You look
Um,
great.
thank you. Thank you.
You're here. You're present and accounted for.
Yeah. Well, let's start off by introducing ourselves and maybe how we know each other or are just meeting each other for the first time here. So
Yeah.
I'll start off. I'm Neil Holtschulte. I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I met Marie through a local writing group, and then met Jessi through Marie.
Yes.
Maria is the tether that binds us.
Because
Indeed.
I'm also local to Albuquerque, but Jessi, you're not.
I'm not. No. Does that
Do
mean
you
it's
want to
my
say
turn to
where
go
you are?
next? Yeah, so I am local to the Bay Area of California. I'm outside of Berkeley, California.
And I'm Marie Parks, and I mostly write fantasy. And Jessi,
Yeah, mostly fantasy, a little bit of science fiction. I kind of dabble in both, but Marie and I are co-writers, co-authors, and the story that we have written together is a contemporary fantasy, which is actually neither of our go-tos when we're writing just independently.
yeah, I don't know how that happened. It's a weird fluke.
Yeah, and I'm writing science fiction, although I've dabbled in fantasy as well.
I very much enjoy your science fiction, by the
Oh,
way.
thank you.
Pick off with that.
Have you finished it? Are you still
I
working on it?
did. No, I finished it the day before yesterday. Because I wanted
Perfect.
to finish it before this conversation. So, and I wanted it to be fresh. So I finished it 2 days ago and I immediately asked Marie whether it was a standalone or there were going to be more. And she informed me that it was meant to be a standalone. And so now I have this burning desire to know how you are possibly capable of writing standalones because I just cannot. Anything I try to write is like, okay, that one idea is now 20 ideas.
Well, I'm interested in talking more about that because I do not feel like I can write a series or I don't I hate to say that I like burn out on an idea, but like I'm very ready to move on by the end.
Hmm.
Interesting. I mean, it
Well,
definitely felt that way. Like it felt like a complete standalone. Like it deserves to be a standalone. At the end, it felt like everything was, tied up in a way that I wasn't like, oh, but when's the next one coming out? I just selfishly wanted to stay in the world a little longer.
Well, thank you. That's fantastic. By the way, you're making me think that we should put up our, books on our screens here at some point.
oh,
Of
actually,
course,
there's like a background.
I can always edit that uh, in post, as it were. But yes, here we go. Let's have our. Oh, see, I have this light. There we go. There we go.
Very nice.
So
Mine is,
Crew of Exiles is mine,
and
and
Unrelenting is mine and Marie's. And Marie
ooh,
just,
somebody knows how to use the technology.
Marie just got the Andy.
Okay, I'm gonna put that away. I'm self-conscious about it.
No, you shouldn't be. That's good.
Well, Jessi made it. So kudos to her. But okay, I will say, because I get sneak peeks of your writing, Neil,
Yeah.
that I have seen you write short stories or things maybe even bordering on like novella length that you have expanded. So
Yes.
it seems like this rule isn't necessarily true for shorter fiction for you.
No. I mean, they're still not series of short stories, but yeah, I think partly it is that I like to read a book and have it be completed. When I read a series, I will typically not read them all in a row. I will read one and then I will put it away and I will read some other stuff and I'll eventually come back to the next one and the next one and the next one. And I didn't used to do that, but I also used to just like force myself to read and not enjoy it. Like, because I have a completionist,
Mm.
sort of mentality. And so if I started a book, I had to finish it, even if I didn't like it. If I started a series, I had to finish it all in a row. Otherwise, it was like, oh, well, it's on my like to-do list.
You're like the person that achievements were made for.
Yes, very much so. So I'm a recovering completionist, and I now like if I now I intend to if I start a series, I'm not going to finish it right away. I'm going to read other stuff. I've read like 10 out of 12 of the Expanse books. I've read a bunch of the Malazan books, also out of order. Now that was not intentional, but I've read some of those. I don't even know which ones I've read at this point. So,
Yeah. I've also read things out of order, and I'm so impressed when I end up really enjoying the book and then not even realizing there was a book prior to it until afterwards. I'm like, wow, I'm really, I don't know how the author did that, but hashtag goals.
for real.
Yeah, which is actually our current struggle because we are writing the sequel to Unrelenting, and that is a new and slightly terrifying challenge. And how many rewrites did we do of the beginning chapters, Jessi, before we finally were sort of like settled on it?
I lost count. I think eventually we probably were just like, we finally sat down. We were like, okay, we can't keep starting over. We just have to take this and run with it and see where it takes us, because otherwise we will be here at the beginning forever.
Yeah. Yeah, it was so frustrating to be at the beginning. And now that we're somewhere in Act 2 right now of drafting, it's feeling better. Although Jessi's really carrying the load right now.
So these were the rewrites to the beginning of the sequel to Unrelenting.
Right.
Yeah, although Unrelenting also got a lot of rewrites.
Sure, but I'm curious about this. So you guys got stuck on the beginning of the second one, and you were doing these revisions. I assume it was partly because what came next sort of depended on it. I assume this was revision that was not like, oh, well, these to be verbs could be action verbs. It was more significant than that.
Yeah, it was. I think we had sort of two real big struggles. One is the struggle we always have, which is we're discovery writers, and exactly what you said, what we write is going to tip the dominoes, and we can't see what's further down the chain until we write what's right in front of us. The other thing that we really struggled with that was sort of a new challenge for us was figuring out how to seed what happened in book one in a way that felt gratifying, not info dumpy, and had that effect of, if you happen to read the books out of order, it didn't just feel like, and now I'm reading a summary of book one. But if you had read book one, it didn't feel like there was information in there that you didn't need to know because you had just read book one. So it was a fine balance to strike, and we struggled a little with that.
Yeah, I think the other big challenge was, in true fantasy style, book one has a significant cast of characters.
Oh, yeah.
And so stepping into book two without throwing 12 new people at the reader at once was tough because they're all kind of clustered in one location. And so, it was kind of a series of, well, we start in maybe one room with maybe two people in it, and then maybe they'll step out into the hall and encounter another person, and then they could go into this room where there's a few other people gathered. So it's, having to drip out the characters.
Yeah, it's been a challenge. It's interesting because I'm in my own critique groups here in actually it's a completely virtual critique group with people all over the US. And most of the people in that group have read the first book, but one person has not intentionally, so that they can be my cold reader for when I'm bringing it to group. They've bought the book and they are refusing to read it until I finish drafting book two, so that they can give that non-reader response, someone who happened to skip book one, to make sure that these things just make sense and can stand on their own.
That's awesome. That's a committed critique partner.
Yeah, it's been really helpful.
So you're talking to me about, discovery writing, and I do know that term, but I'm just going to define it for anybody else who eventually watches this. So discovery writing is when you're writing without an outline, without even necessarily knowing how the ending is going to turn out, or even the next chapter. And you don't necessarily know that. Now, that being said, I'd like to ask you more about your discovery writing process, because I think that term gets thrown around, and I suspect that everybody has a different approach to what that means to them as a writer. So I'm interested in tell me a little bit more. Like, for example, do you have a decent sense of what's happening in the next chapter, in the next act, in the end, or how discovery is it, I guess?
Well, I think it depends from project to project. It's very different for this book than it was for the first book, because there are some seeds that we planted in the first book that we know have to grow in this book. So there are some things that have to happen that when we started writing the first book, we were just like, I don't know, we're just going to write and see where we end up. Now we have actual guardrails to an extent. We kind of know we know what's happening in the beginning. We know some things that have to happen by the end, but we haven't quite placed them yet. So I think that that's a big difference. And then I also think it's different when Marie and I are working on our co-writing projects versus when Marie is working on her solo project and I'm working on my solo project. I think discovery writing happens in all of these different avenues, but it does look a little different each time.
Yeah, so I consider I'm sorry, go ahead, Marie.
No. I mean, I would just say, like, for instance, Jessi and I do have some ideas of what's going to happen in the end of book 2. We don't quite know how we're getting there. The middle feels fuzzy. So when you said, don't know what's happening in the end, or even what's happening in the next chapter, like, to me, the next chapter is much harder to get my hands around than the end for some reason. And it's like the book I'm currently working on. I was about to grab it off my desk as if it exists. It doesn't. It's here and in Google Docs. But that book, like, I've known the ending almost from the beginning, but the middle was just moosh.
Yeah, so I was going to say that I consider myself a discovery writer as well. At least with Crew of Exiles, I certainly was. I had a premise, I had 4 characters, and that's what I started with, and that was it. And the opening, for those who have read it, is very much me asking myself, well, how do they all come together? Like, that's priority number 1. And as I wrote that, bigger problems developed in a good way. I mean, problems for the characters, not for me. It was solutions for me. It was fantastic. And that sort of drove into, the Act 2 and Act 3. Now, I did very significant rewrites, changing entirely the ending from what I had in the first draft, because I did very much discovery write it, and it didn't have as much of an arc. Actually, I should probably go back and reread my first draft, which is posted on my blog online still, just to see like what exactly that ending looked like, because it's such a distant memory for me at this point.
Yeah, this is something that Jessi and I were talking about the other day. Was this idea. I don't know if you're like a very visual writer, Neil, but like when I'm writing, I can really see everything playing out in my mind like a movie. I know some people don't have that experience, but it is so interesting. It's like when I have something written and then I edit that detail, it's like the world morphs over that old thing and then just kind of puts it away somewhere, and it's gone, which is why I actually always keep a deleted scenes folder, because sometimes on occasion something out of that will be useful to me, and if not, we'll just stick it in our Patreon. But yeah, it's amazing how my brain is able so quickly to forget something that an idea I've disregarded.
Yeah, because I think the risk without doing that is you end up with 2 very similar but slightly different versions of a world kind of overlapping each other. And then you start contradicting yourself. And that's when you end up with all these consistency issues, which we did run into when we were revising book one because of those changes. And it was like, oh, is the glass supposed to be shattered? Is that, person supposed to be in that place? And it, that was the mess of revisions that ended up happening afterwards.
There was a lot of mess of revisions.
I super relate to that. My current work in progress, I'm just having such a hard time writing the ending. And this is something where I thought I'd figured out the ending before I actually wrote it for the first time, before I finished the first draft. And I wrote it's not quite an outline. It's sort of I guess you could call it a first draft, but it was something that like, it didn't even have like dialogue. It didn't even have setting. It was just like, this happens, then this happens, then this happens at a fairly fine-grained level, but not a story in any way, shape, or form otherwise. And then I've tried to sort of rewrite over top of that so that I at least know what I'm doing next and what I'm doing next after that. And what you made me think of is I have one character who, I mean, it's so rough at this point that like I'm not even sure who my cast is. And so I have this one character who just like, I was like, oh yeah, no, that's actually not going to be a character. And then I got to one of my other later plot points in my own, let's call it outline. And it was like, this character does essential thing. And I was like, oh, we do have that character, it turns out.
Yeah.
You've been here all along.
You've been here all along. You've just been really quiet.
Yeah. It's so true. I remember when we were editing Unrelenting, at one point we finally got the bright idea to open up a separate Google Doc and keep an injury tracker. So that we could just keep track of how the various ways in which people were injured so that they weren't magically not injured a chapter later, or injured, like their right arm was injured in one chapter and then it's their left arm in another chapter. Just like all those little nuances that just get lost.
Yeah,
I had a spreadsheet that I had a spreadsheet that I can't find anymore. I think I deleted it. Why would I do that? But it had it wasn't that detailed, but it had vertical columns. It was Excel that I'd color coded, where it was like, this is the first moment in the book. It was like by chapter. It might have been by scene, actually, within chapters. It was like, this is the first moment within the book where this problem is mentioned or arises, and then this is where it gets resolved. And I was just like sort of like visually trying to like assess all these like colored streamers going down the spreadsheet, which it was kind of visually interesting. I'm sure it must have helped. I hope. I'm sure. I think it helped my subconscious more than it helped like anything where I was like, oh, the streamers, they should be, arranged more artfully. I don't know.
It's like a Gant chart, but turned 90 degrees.
What's a Gant chart?
Yeah, Gant. This is like project management. Boring.
No, I've heard this acronym. I just don't remember what it's.
I don't know what the acronym stands for, but it's basically like there's things. So there's like it'd be like for your job, right? So it'd be like, do this thing, or maybe this event is taking place and it'll have dates along the top. And so it's like, yeah, this is taking place these 2 weeks. And then this thing, we got to get this completed by that date. And so that way you can see where projects begin and end compared with each other, or tasks or whatever. But this could be character problems. My character problem begins in this scene and ends
on this auspicious Tuesday.
Yeah.
I had to Google it, and yes, it's very much that. It's not an acronym. It's named after Henry Gant. So,
okay.
There we go.
Well, thanks, Henry. It's useful. It's one of my favorite types of charts.
I feel like writing is such a, like, we're basically having this conversation where we're all discovery writers, and we're all like you said, Neil, like, here are this colored streamers that we pull out, like, here's the chaos of what that looks like. And like, there are so many different types of art form where there's a prescribed way to approach it. Like if you're an instrument maker, or if you're like what you crochet, there are certain different types of, ways of crocheting you learn. And I feel like with writing, it's just anarchy. It's just, everyone's different. Everyone has their own chaos. And yet somehow we all end up with these little neat like books with a cover on them. And like, they make sense, hopefully. Like, it's just kind of magical how that ends up happening.
Absolutely. I think maybe that's why it's so profitable. I don't know, profitable, but there's so many books on writing with different tips.
Yeah.
Yeah. And none of them are like gonna fully work for anyone, I think, except for whoever wrote it. Like they're like, this is the way. Well, it's like, yeah, because that's your way. Like, I'm glad you found your way. And often there's great advice in them that you can pick and choose. But yeah.
Even then, I sometimes doubt, like, do you do this? Do you do exactly this? I do like Save the Cat, so I've become a Save the Cat fan a little bit, but in reading the parts of it where the author goes and takes some widely known book and shows, oh, here are the beats of this widely known book. There are parts where I think it's a woman. I don't remember who the author is. Anyway, I'm gonna say she, where she she'll say like, oh, but this book does it slightly differently in these parts and these parts, and I'm like, okay, so you mean the book doesn't do it your way, right? Like that's what you're saying. Like, and I just wonder, like, I wonder partially also, like, as you're writing this, is this the best match that you could find for your beat sheet for Save the Cat? And I don't know how nervous were you putting this out there? I don't know. I'm just curious about those sorts of things. I want to sympathize with the author's anxiety as I read a book.
There's a fellow writer who's in a community that Marie and I are in who made this really amazing spreadsheet. His name is Michael Roth. I think his website's michaelrothwrites.com, maybe.
I will verify this for you.
Yeah, and his the spreadsheet is basically things like Save the Cat, like the 3-act structure, like the 7-point plot structure, all embedded on top of each other and next to each other. So you can see how they all work together and or don't, and like kind of pick and choose which ones, because what I write is sort of a blend. I really like the 7-point plot structure that Dan Wells talks about a lot, and the 3-act structure. And I just kind of have created like this weird hybrid of the two. So it's kind of interesting to see them all laid out side by side.
Yeah, one of the things I like about Save the Cat is because the beats are fairly fine grained. There's certainly way more than 7 of them. So I like it often as just an idea of sort of what can I do next? Like, when it says it's not called Promise of the Premise. It's like the have fun part in like end of Act 1 or something like that.
Yeah.
Say it again. Do you got it?
Fun and games or something like
Fun
that.
and games. That's the one.
I've not actually read this book, but I've seen
But we've all encountered the ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the fun and games, like the idea of like, oh, okay, right. So, I'm writing some wild and crazy space opera. This is where there should be laser blasts flying everywhere. Like that's the sort of like that's my idea for what comes next. Great. That sort of helps give me a little bit of a guidance, more of a suggestion than actual beat.
I've been using this. It's a teeny ebook. It's not going to show up. 5 Secrets of Story Structure by K.M. Weiland. There we go. I think that this ebook, last I checked, was like a couple bucks. And it actually gives me percentages through the book to try to hit for a few different things. And I found that helpful. And discerning, I think it's kind of like a 7 or 8 point plot structure, kind of, you could lay it on top of like a 3-act structure or something like that. But I found that helpful because one thing that I did not realize until I think it was Mary Robinette Kowal who said this in like a lecture, but like, I've read fantasy and science fiction all my life. And I didn't realize until she said this that there are no actual beats for fantasy or science fiction. These genres are set dressing, as she calls it, but you could write any type of story to be a fantasy or science fiction or a horror, or like really any type of speculative fiction like that it's just the environment that you're laying on top of. Maybe it's a romance, or maybe it's a coming of age story, or maybe it's a journey story, or maybe it's maybe you don't have anything to go off of based on anything. You know, you're writing a kind of a unique type of story. And so I think that's how I realized, like, oh, maybe this is why this is why plotting is difficult for me. And it wasn't until I started writing my current solo project, which is a heist, which actually does have beats that the readers are expecting, that I finally was like, oh, okay, this feels way easier. Now, I'm not saying I'll pull it off, but it's definitely easier to kind of know what's coming next and to not have to just fumble around the way I have ever since I started, you know, scribbling stories in like, you know, 5th grade or whatever.
Yeah, I remember you pointing this out to me, and it was something that like um I think is fairly obvious, but like it's really helpful to have somebody articulate. And uh
Well,
I kind of want to just repeat that back in my own words, just to like clarify what we're talking about here. Is like you go to the section of the bookstore that's like mysteries, or you go to the romance section. Those categories have beats. They have, you know, romance has the meet cute, and it has the somebody's secret comes out and ruins things. And like, yeah, there are variations on this, obviously, but there's sort of these expected points throughout the book. Whereas you go to the sci-fi fantasy section, and that's not like there's no particular beats. Like you said, I think you said it's the setting or it's the window dressing. Like there's romance within that, or there's a heist within that, or there's a mystery, a detective, you know, story within that. Um, and so yeah, genre is all weird because you know it means something, but it actually means like very different things. The categories themselves aren't like consistent with each other.
yeah, and I mean, I think this is only, you say it's obvious, but I think it's only obvious if you're widely read enough to have read enough romance books to recognize that there's a pattern emerging from these books that you're reading, or enough mystery books to recognize the pattern. I was just this little, you know, heathen sitting here just reading fantasy books and science fiction books. And then, you know, because I was an English major in college, classics, which also have anarchy. Like there's no rhyme or reason to any of this. So I didn't know even that was an option, that was a thing, that there are like types of books where readers expect things to happen. That blew my mind. When like the first time I heard the phrase beats, I was like, what is that? What is a beat? Is that like a cop's beat? Like, what does that mean?
And I
Yeah,
think that's a really good point because like speaking of the classics, you know, speaking of like the Save the Cat thing where I was saying like, okay, well you're admitting that like it doesn't quite fit in these books. Like, you know, does does the Lord of the Rings follow any particular types of beats? Like, I mean, and everyone loves it. You know, I think
Yeah.
that's a, I don't know. I always, whenever we bring up writing rules, somebody has to poke holes in them, right?
there are no rules. That's it. It really is anarchy. But I feel like as discovery writers, specifically writing within the science fiction and fantasy genre, if you don't overlay something like a heist or a romance or something like that, it's like discovery writer on hard mode. It's just like
Yeah.
you can be a discovery writer who writes romance, but at least you have goalposts. You have things that you know the reader will expect to see. Just, you know, kind of your general like unrelenting general kind of contemporary fantasy, not so much. It's just kind of like,
Well, actually, after the fact, after the book was written, I think it was already like deep in editing, like, you know, probably like in layout at that point. And we heard Dan Wells talking about like, these are the hallmarks of a thriller. And we were like, oh, we wrote a thriller. Well, that would have been good to know that we
yeah.
could have followed those beats. We
Yeah.
accidentally stumbled into that. Cool.
Yeah, I think we actually ended up putting his blurb on our book, calling it a supernatural thriller. And we're like, yep, planned that all along.
But like, I think we got the blurb from him before we had that realization. We were a little slow on the
Played it on hard mode.
Yeah, that's super relatable though. And I kind of like that about discovery writing. I don't know. I think that more and more, I think I'm actually fairly widely read. I know many people might debate me on that, but Especially lately. I think I've, crossed some different genres and things. And I don't know, I like not totally expecting and knowing sort of like what's structurally going to happen next. I mean, especially once you're reading enough, it kind of dulls the emotional hit when you know, like, oh, because we're this percentage of the way through and good things are happening, bad thing is going to happen right now. And like, yeah, partly the anticipation actually like is sort of fun in and of itself, but it's also nice to just have some surprise.
Yeah, for sure. So actually, I'm curious about that for you, Neil, for your process, because you were saying that you often start one of the first elements you start with when you're thinking about a story or when you were thinking about Crew of Exiles was a cast of characters or maybe a particular character. And you also have an idea for the world. So as you're thinking then about, okay, well, how do I take this idea of a character or a cast of characters and make that into a story? Are you thinking of it more in terms of how they interact with the world you're building, or more in terms of their character arcs, or like how does that sort of spool out for you as you start like thinking about what's next for those characters?
Yeah. So I think that it's a little bit all over the place. Um, I think that for me, uh, I like characters that have a really strong core personality trait. So Beryl is just going to be stubborn and drag his feet about everything and complain the whole time and be a resistance force. And Fife is exactly the opposite, and that's, why they're the way they are, because that creates conflict. But also, like, um, there's a similar sort of dynamic between Nesh and Onsi of my characters. So like Nesh wants to be very passive and very agreeable, and Onsi wants to be very bossy and commanding to everybody, right? So partly just like having a really super bossy character and a really super optimistic go-getter, this is going to work, we're going to do X, like that'll immediately like drive things forward. Um, and also like it just all those things define how they interact with the environment. Now, in terms of how does that actually lead to the plot and the story, well, I think I've been learning a lot about that actually with my current work in progress, because I went back and wrote some stuff that I thought would be like a prologue or something, and then I really enjoyed writing it, and I was just like having all these interesting ideas, and I realized that like the character has to come from somewhere, which I know sounds really obvious, like, oh, you discovered backstory, Neil, good job. But I think that starting then to think about, okay, so you have this idea for what their sort of core personality trait is, um, what is their backstory then, helps even more with that like interaction with the world, right? I still think I have a lot to learn in that area in terms of um, getting just right sort of where that person is in the world and how that drives the plot forward. Because a lot of times the obstacles that I write are often internal. I find it like, you'll read my stories and they all have external obstacles, but from my point of view, I feel super fake about those. It's like as if I did a bad job. But it's not that I did a bad job, it's just that they're kind of like they're not at the forefront of my mind. I haven't written a good villain like ever, and I would love to at some point, but like it I don't know. For me, when I think about the problems they have, it's almost always some internal thing that they need to overcome. I don't know if
This
that
is
answered your question. I might have digressed there a bit.
this is something I was actually commenting on to Marie as I was reading this. She was sort of getting the play-by-play as I was reading Crew of Exiles, and like, oh, I got to this part. Oh, I got to this part, since I knew she had already read it. And one of the things I kept coming back to was the strength of the characters in the story. Like the plot is super interesting, the world is super interesting, but the thing that really drove me to keep turning the page was I really fell in love with each character for a different reason, and with their arc, and with the kind of growth potential that they had right from the first time that you meet them. You can see there's so much potential for each character to grow in a completely different way, and I thought that was just really well executed.
Thank you.
And there's just a bit of magic too in the exact cast that you have. When you do have characters with those 4 primary personality traits, yes, there's the opportunity for tension, but there's also the opportunity for banter and affection and sort of everything in between. And so that's part of it too, right? Is that you're rooting for all of them. You're rooting for the whole group by the time especially they start colliding.
Yeah, it's really fun. I hope you guys have found this as well. It's really fun to get feedback on these characters. Like sometimes I get nervous because I have had people say like, I wasn't totally sold on your first chapter because there's this only one character and he's super negative. And I was just like, blah, I didn't like reading that. This is what the person is telling me, right? But I haven't heard anybody, say in the end, like, oh, I really hated that guy still at the end.
It's really interesting. I think, in some ways, Marie and I fought a similar battle with Unrelenting in our main character, Bridget, coming across as super unlikable to some people, especially in those first few chapters. The first one in particular, where she in that chapter is confronting someone, and depending on how you view it and how you view the world, you can just be like, that's a really petulant, bossy person. Why would I want to follow them around for a whole book? And Marie and I had a lot of conversations about what to do about that, whether we should adjust her personality at all, whether we should tone her down. And ultimately we decided that that's just not who she is. And the growth potential that she has is really dependent on these characteristics that, in her case, inform her sense of determination, sense of loyalty, things that carry her through the whole book that in the real world may come across. If a woman goes somewhere and comes across as demanding, people may say that person is bossy and petulant, when in reality, they're just sticking up for something that they believe in.
Right.
Yeah, that's really interesting because, maybe I was colored by having, read some of Unrelenting in the writing critique group, but I certainly, opening up that book, Bridget in the first chapter, okay, main character is very focused, very determined, has a very clear goal. I thought that was absolutely a strength, and is going to pursue it. And I was like, great, classic, right? Like, what's wrong with that? So I was super on board for that aspect of it, and that totally made sense to me. And also, like, it's a book. Like, I know that, and what I mean by that is, I know that, like, it's not going to be the case that, like, oh, the police detective was right. This is just like a case that's not going to go anywhere, and like, there's not going to be any reveals, and Bridget was wrong.
I'm just gonna go home and
just one chapter. That's it.
3,000 words were done.
She's gonna just get over her sister being missing by the end, and that's her growth, right? Like, no, obviously not that. That's not the case.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, that was interesting though for us to like get that feedback and have to figure out, like, is this actually a problem, or is this actually a problem with society?
Nice. Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And is it something we want to stand behind? And actually, in some ways, we're running into this problem again in the sequel a little bit, because we have a tendency to write very strong personalities, and we keep ending up in scenes where they're just all bickering with one another. Like, it feels like the same argument is happening over and over and over again, because that is how each of their personalities plays out. And so as we're revising these scenes that we're initially writing, we're having to be very cognizant of making sure that they're not acting just like a bunch of siblings in a room having the same fight for the same piece of candy over and over and over again.
We keep saying like, we're someone needs to be affable here. Who's it gonna be?
Who is the adult in this situation? The likable one? The something?
Well, I do think that is good advice. I remember I first got back into really, or actually probably the first time I got into seriously writing. I was living in Rochester, New York. This was like around about 2008, and they have a writing center there called Writers and Books that is phenomenal and puts on classes, for the community and whatnot. And I was writing these short stories at the time, and I kept getting feedback that none of my characters were likable. And I was definitely like just like dumping like emotional baggage onto the page like the entire time. And I didn't even consciously like make this change, but there's been a huge change in the quality and also enjoyability of my writing when I started writing characters that were more like, I don't know if how I come off to other people, but like there's this really dark, cynical core inside of me. And instead of writing that like all the time for every single character, writing characters that were more aspirational. And that was huge for me.
And I also feel like, having read at least portions of numbers of your pieces, including shorts, including longer works, there's always this air of humor. There's always maybe a kernel of hope, which can lead to maybe that humor or that bright spot or whimsy or something, to just like allow the reader to breathe. So even if you are tackling an issue that's quite dark and heavy and serious, there is that light. And I think that's something that we struggle with a little bit. It's helpful when you do have a character who's naturally more optimistic or a bit bubbly or excited, or something, to come in there and have some interplay. But some of the stuff we're writing right now, there just doesn't happen to be a character like that in the forefront. And so it just feels a bit heavy as a result. And so that's something that, we're kind of cognizant of and know that we need to take a look at in revisions so that it actually is an enjoyable read.
I was gonna say that is a revision problem.
Yeah.
But I really like what you said, Neil, about how originally it was that like kind of core of cynicism that was getting put on the page, because they always say like, write what you know. And the first thing that is kind of that deep part of you that ends up on the page, which for me is also cynicism of some degree. And I think what's been interesting over the years is learning how to capture different facets of myself and isolate them, and allowing like the bit of me that is an optimist to actually become a fully fledged character, because not all of me is a cynic all the time. It's just the thing that I was defaulting to. And so like learning that methodology of just kind of like picking through your own personality and seeing what could be a seed for like a fully fleshed out human being or non-human being is kind of interesting.
I feel like therapy helps with this a lot.
Yes.
I was about to ask before, Jessi, you started sort of answering my question ahead of time, is sort of, has there been any self knowledge that you've discovered? Has there been any self-learning that you're willing to share from your writing experience?
I need deadlines. Real bad. Real bad. You look like you're about to say something, Marie. Go ahead.
Yeah, so like, I think that I have discovered that at my core, I am an optimist, even though I used to define myself as a realist. So it's quite easy for me to sort of tap into all parts of that spectrum, including pessimism. I've also discovered that I am a slow processor of emotions. And oftentimes I personally don't have a name for the emotion I'm experiencing, or even the consciousness that I'm experiencing an emotion until later. And so later I can say, oh, you know what? I was angry, and probably underneath that anger was shame or something like that. I can think about it and reflect, but it takes me a little while to get to that point. And some of that may just be practice. I don't know. But the problem with that is it doesn't translate super well on the page. That readers really expect fast processing of emotions, because by the time the character has figured out that they were angry and maybe a little bit shameful, but it's like 12 hours later, 400 other things have happened at this point, at least in kind of a driving plot where things are happening swiftly. So that might work better if I were like a literary writer or something like that, where I could take a bit more breathing space. But because I do want these like driving actiony plots, there just isn't time to be a slow processor. So I've really learned that like the way I experience my emotions doesn't work, and I have to adapt to something else that is more sensical, I guess, and keeps the story looking forward as opposed to back.
Or, and this is my counterpoint to that, my argument to that, because I'm also a slow processor. So this is something that both Marie and I have struggled with together on our co-written stuff and independently. Find a way to make that slow processing a meaningful part of the character's experience and calling it out directly, so that it becomes something that the reader expects, because it's not going to be something the reader expects by default.
That sounds awesome. Yeah, that sounds really powerful as well. So you can bring it back to something that, because you can't be the only people that have that sense of like, I'm not even super aware of what I'm feeling right now, and like it's going to take me some time to figure it out. I mean, anytime, obviously, we can bring that really real experience to a character. I think that's a really powerful thing. I was almost feeling like I wanted to get into like critique group mode there for a second, though, and be like, well, here's my advice on what you should do. But I think that, anyway, I don't know. I think that bringing some of that calling it out, like you said, is that's a great idea.
I think you have to, because otherwise I think readers will just be confused. Like, this terrible thing happened to this character. Why are they not angry? And then like 48 hours they're angry, and it's like, why are they angry? That thing happened 48 hours ago. Like, it just doesn't make sense to people who are fast processors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And for me, I'd be like, oh my gosh, it's my experience on the page the first time in my life. Yeah. So
I have, oh, go ahead. Oh, how about me?
I
what have
wanted
I
to turn
learned?
your question back on you. Yeah.
Oh, I mean, I was kind of thinking of that part earlier of like, I mean, I guess I framed it as like what makes my writing better, but just like getting more in touch with a hopeful, optimistic, go-getter sort of side of it. I mean, go-getter's that's not accurate, because I've always been that, but like it's always come from a place of like, I'm not good enough, right?
Yeah.
Rather than like good things can happen. That can also be very motivating. So I don't know exactly what I learned about myself. Like I knew I was sort of, having these sort of dark, cynical thoughts, but like getting in touch with that positive side has been beneficial. Um, oh, my favorite one, I guess, was, uh, oh man, I was having some existential crisis. I think just generally I don't know if I hadn't been feeling well or something, or just getting older, and I was talking to my wife, who is also named Marie, so I'm going to say Marie, but it's a different person. Um, and I was telling her like, I'm having these thoughts about like I'm nervous about getting old. I'm really scared about getting old, and I'm scared at how that will change my perspective on things. And she said like, I know a book that you should read. And I was like, oh, really? What book? And she says, it's called Crew of Exiles. And I was like, oh, that's really sweet. And then I hadn't even really like thought about like, oh yeah, like Beryl's whole thing is that being this like ancient being this ancient creature, has really like morphed his perspective in kind of a toxic way. And he's sort of rediscovering a youthful energy is a lot of his arc. And so I don't know. I learned about myself that like I'm struggling with things directly on the page that I didn't even know that I was struggling with necessarily.
Yeah, this is a theme in your work, is immortality.
Yeah.
And it's not just around organic beings such as us, but yeah, that it's interesting when you start seeing the themes. Like Jessi, you have themes. Like there's an interesting theme that crops up for Jessi. I'm gonna just call you out, of twins, twin sisters, especially. Jessi doesn't have a sister or a twin, right? So like, what it's not just because that's cool, but there's something in there, right? Like, I don't know. It's just interesting.
I mean, it very much could be all the Sweet Valley High I read as a child. So who knows?
Maybe I don't need to like go all
Well,
psychoanalysis.
Don't deflect. Open up. This is therapy.
Tell us
No.
about
what I will say is I may have gotten the inspiration for the twin from something I read as a child, but you know, I have two younger brothers and I always wanted a sister. So that came from that. And then the idea of siblings who are discovering what their relationship for one another means is something that does show up very much in all of my work, whether those siblings are blood siblings, like blood related, or if they're found family. So this idea of like, what would you do for family? And it does not have to be your biological family to count as family. That is something that has been an emerging theme for me over the years. Apparently I just like shocked you all into silence.
trying to
No, I mean,
about
I don't know.
themes in my own
That was
stuff.
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel the need to ask, we're at almost an hour here. If you want to go much further, I mean, this has been a super fun conversation. And you know, we didn't even remotely need to, you know, go to talking points or conversation starters. I would certainly not mind talking further, and I have a particular topic that I would enjoy discussing. So if you're both good for it, we can go to that. What do you think?
And I have to know what this topic is.
Well, the topic is fan fiction.
Oh, yes, let's talk about that.
So, and let me preface this with my prior knowledge, which through Marie, I know that, or I believe that my understanding is that you two met through the Animorph fandom and doing fan fiction on the Animorph books, which I never actually read, but I am reading along with my wife currently, and we're on like book 4 or something. And I was thinking about popping this in earlier because I don't know, just the discussion of like emotion and, you know, sort of processing and showing that emotion right away. So the Animorph books, one of the things that I'm completely psychoanalyzing Marie, you in particular, by the way, while I'm reading these books, like your writing style, like, and how it intermingles with how the Animorphs do it.
That's
and so maybe I shouldn't be
Well,
doing that, but
no, please do.
but it's got a very, I mean, I wouldn't even call them young adult books. I would call them kids books, not in like a I'm learning my words type, you know, that young, but
You're
like
reading level 5, so meant for 5th graders, 10
Sure.
year olds.
Yeah, something like that. And it's a super straightforward writing style. And often, you know, someone will emote sort of physically, and then like there will literally be a line of text that will say like Cassie was angry, like, you know, just like spelling it out for you in case you didn't quite get that. And so I think that I mean I was sort of having this preconceived notion anyway, but like it's super amenable to getting someone into fan fiction, I feel, because it's very much a telling style. There is showing in it, but it's not very much. And whenever there is showing, there's also telling, it seems. And I also am just interested in talking about fan fiction in general. I've done some fan fiction myself, not in Animorphs, obviously, but it's a fun thing. And anyway, any responses to any of that nonsense I was blabbering about?
First of all, I'm really excited that you're reading Animorphs with Marie. I can't believe that. The resurgence is interesting. And by the way, there are graphic novels coming out. I think the third one just dropped very recently. So those are quite good and worth checking out and have less telling because of the art form.
Oh, yeah.
So FYI, if you're looking for a nice compliment, they're obviously coming out slower than the books that have been out since the 90s. But
yeah, it's interesting. I think my first fan fiction experience ever was with Animorphs because I started reading it when I was in 5th grade. I was exactly the target age for it. So my first time knowing what fan fiction was, I was like, I love this book series. I want to write something in this world. And I think you're right. It's accessible, especially for middle graders, in that you don't have to work too hard to understand what's going on, how people are feeling, even while you're dealing with like weird alien stuff that you've never obviously experienced as a 5th grader. Like, you can still comprehend it really easily. But there's also just so much potential, I think, in that world. You get so many snippets of things that's all you get. And so I think it's also really well set up for fan fiction because there are so many avenues that you can explore that are left unexplored as you read the series.
yeah,
Absolutely. Go ahead, Marie.
I think the thing about Animorphs for me is, if anybody's watching this who isn't familiar with them or just thinks, oh, those are the books from the 90s with the kids turning into like leopards or whatever, it is, in my opinion, a profound commentary on war and the impact of war on individuals and societies, and how those societies interact with each other and treat their veterans, I don't know, it's you're maybe not quite deep enough into it to have seen a lot of that yet, Neil, but and there's also deep discussions around comfort or lack thereof in your own body, really like body dysmorphia. There's discussions of what was the other one I was going to say? I mean, identity, really, like, how do you identify? Do you pigeonhole yourself? Can you grow from that? There's sort of this like meta stuff going on, right? Where it's like a character will be like, well, I'm the warrior. And then it's like, okay, but what if the warrior's scared? Or like, I'm the funny one. And like, what if the funny one is grieving? And so, yeah, so to me, because it one thing I appreciate so much about K.A. Applegate and Michael Grant, the husband-wife duo who co-wrote these books, is that they don't pull their punches, even though their readers were in middle school and even elementary school, that they said, hey, these are hard things. And, maybe we do need to talk about what happens if the pacifist is forced to kill. Maybe we do need to talk about what happens if the prideful one is full of shame, or the leader doesn't know what to do. So I think that all of that does get fully explored, but in the books, but I think it does pave the way for fan fiction because it opens the door to really any question. Any hard question can be asked. And so let's keep asking them. And also like just weird shenanigans.
And I think, there was something very unique about this book series where I don't think, full disclosure, this can turn into an hour of Animorphs. So,
oh, I'm sure.
please rein us in. But I think, everything Marie said is absolutely true. And I think that this book series was very unique in that it would have been hard for it to exist at any other time period because it was a time period where series books for children were very popular, and the the publishing industry was basically telling K.A. Applegate and Michael Grant to pump out a new book every month. Every single month, a new one came out, and they were just writing. There were not really systems in place for checks and balances around, is this something a 10-year-old should be reading about?
Is it age appropriate?
Yeah.
Am I going to get sued?
Like, I mean, these books talk about suicidal ideation. They talk about, mauling people, murder. They talk about all of these really dark, heavy topics that would probably be pretty hard to publish in that way these days towards that particular audience. And so I think one of the interesting things, I won't say nice, but one of the interesting things from a fan fiction perspective is, even though I was 10 when I picked these books up, the lessons are just as relevant to me right now as a 36-year-old woman. Mm-hmm. And like those stories in that world is still vibrant to me as a playground to write in, because those issues are still very real and there are infinite ways to explore them.
This is already super interesting to me because I'm reading them as an adult. I did not experience them, as a kid. And certainly I saw some of this stuff, like even by book 4, you mentioned like suicidal ideation. Like I know at least one part you're referring to because we were reading and we were like, oh, whoa. Yeah. And yeah, I didn't think about, the time period in which they were published and the speed, sort of, the checks and sort of going over them and being like, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and, taming it or whatever wasn't happening. Mm-hmm. Certainly, I think the strength for an adult reader of the books, one of the strengths at least, the one that sticks out most prominently to me, is whenever they morph into a new animal, they have this challenge of the animal's mindset, getting into what it is like to live as this creature, and what does this creature focus on, and what is its mindset, whether it's some very fearful little tiny rodent, or something, the dolphins. We just got past the dolphins are all playful, right, all the time.
Wait till you get to the Borg. I mean, ants.
What's that?
Nothing. I was saying, wait till you get to the Borg. I mean, the ants. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, that sounds amazing. I look forward to that.
That's your next book. That's book number 5.
Oh, fantastic. Okay. I love that you knew that it was book 5. Like, that's a true fan right there. Yeah. There are like 52 of these things.
There are 54, 60 if you count all of the extra books, including Megamorph.
There we go.
But like, don't forget the Chronicles, Neil, please. They're some of the best books.
They really are. Like, you have to read the Chronicles.
Okay. Yeah. I'll have to look that up. The Chronicles, do they come later? Or do they?
Yeah, they're dripped out within the main series. So every once in a while, because it wasn't enough to ask K.A. Applegate and Michael Grant to release a regular size book every month, every like 6 months or so, they would also release either a Megamorphs or a Chronicles, which was like 2 to 3 times the length. And if it was a Megamorphs, it was the same core cast doing something kind of
rotating cast.
Yeah, with a rotating POV. It was sort of just like a big book where you got all of their POVs. And then with the Chronicles, it's just like side characters you never really see the POVs of. They get a book.
But some of those are mind-blowing and like some of the best stuff in the series, actually. Yes. Anyway, sorry, the strength, go ahead.
Please tell us when you get to the David trilogy, by the way.
God. Okay, sorry.
Oh, good. We're going to have to do like 8 more of these, I'm sure.
It's
just going to be an Animorph. It's just going to be an Animorph like subset of videos on my channel.
Yeah, wait till you get into the nuclear warfare section. Anyway, carry on.
Wow.
I'm not kidding. Carry on.
No, I believe you. I think all I was going with was that, the idea of figuring out who you are, I'm sure it was immensely impactful for, the target demographic age range, and being able to sort of explore the other perspectives through being some other animal is just like a brilliant, I mean, the premise is brilliant. Okay. I mean, just for straight off the bat, the premise is genius. and particularly good, I think, for that. And so I am appreciating these insights from longtime fans so that now I can maybe have a new appreciation as I read onward.
So
But
I'm curious to wrench us away from another hour of talking about Animorphs. I'm curious, what was your fandom?
Yeah.
yeah, so I've done three different fandoms, fan fictions, and two of them will never ever see the light of day because they're immensely embarrassing. I mean, I would say that my start in writing was I was in daycare. I don't remember how old. I mean, it might have been, I was like at least like 6 or 7 or something. And it was one of these just like, everybody was going every which way. There were a bunch of kids. It was just at like somebody's house, right? And The Empire Strikes Back was on TV, like in the background, like as just extra noise, and like just like anybody who's occupied by that, great, because like the parents are, just having enough trouble as it is, or the adults are. Um, and I started watching it, and I was just like awestruck. I had no idea what was going on. I came in not right at the beginning, not that that would have helped, and I had no clue what was happening, but it was the most brilliant thing I had ever encountered in my young life. And I remember distinctly that I went home and I told my mother that I had to write about this, but I was very young and like could hardly type at all. Um, and she very generously like took dictation at least that one
Oh,
evening. Um, and So that was my start. And so I wrote a complete direct ripoff of the Battle of Hoth as my young mind remembered it. And so that was my start. I'm not sure I followed up on that very much at all. And then I did a Super Metroid fanfic, which was at least a little bit more creative, but just in that universe. Obviously, I played that game as a young person, and that's an amazing game. Um, and then also, I wrote, and this was at the time the longest thing I'd ever completed. It was like a 40,000 word novella of Final Fantasy VI,
nice.
released as Final Fantasy III in the United States. But um, and that like Final Fantasy VI probably has the largest impact on my perspective and writing style. And I could talk about how that idea of sort of cynical bad things happening, but like having optimism throughout. I mean, that's what the whole game is about, right? I saw somebody else once describe the game as um, like nothing good ever happens in that entire game, and yet the heroes are hopeful all the way through the end. And when that person said that, it was just like mind shattering to me of like, oh yeah, that's why I love that game. Um, and I really actually love that fan fiction, and I've absolutely posted it and even like linked to it through my webpage because like I think it's actually great. I love it. It's a uh, it's not. I wouldn't call it a sequel so much as I feel that it wraps up some emotional loose ends from the game itself. So
Yeah, I think that's part of the beauty of fan fiction, right? Is that you get to end your relationship with the fandom or carry on your relationship with the fandom on your own terms and at your own pace. And so maybe it is a way of processing. Sometimes it's just a way of playing around and just, having fun. But yeah, it's a chance to, because there is a bit of grief, when something really profound and poignant for you ends. Like, everyone talks about like the end of book blues, when you just read a book that you just love and you're just kind of down for the next day because it's over. And it's just an opportunity to say, like, I'm not done with you yet.
I mean, when Animorphs came to an end, I was literally just like on my bed, bawling, full on, just
Same.
tears for multiple reasons.
Probably a
One
whole
of which
day.
that it was over. I was just like a mess. Because we grew up with them, and when you grow up with something, and I think it was published from 96 to 2001, which were like for Maria and myself, because we're about the same age, that's like fifth grade through 11th grade or something like that, which is just like such formative years. So it really, yeah. So, and
Yeah,
that's why we still write fan fiction and role play within the Animorphs universe, because we don't know how to let bygones be bygones.
there's a yeah, there's like an author's note at the end of that last book where they like thank, you know, the readers for being on the journey and like talk a bit about that sort of like, I think they talk about like the not pulling punches and stuff. And kind of say like, you know, this is a war series. I don't know how you thought this was going to end. But there's a line at the end too where they talk about like, you know, you've been a part of this community, thank you. And they're like, you may now demorph. And I just at that point really I still don't even quite know what to make of that because I haven't. But I think it was, yeah, this acknowledgement of like, okay, this is a container and it is what it is, you know, and you can step out of this now if it served you. And I think it did serve us. And also like at the point at which Jessi and I continue to write in the Animorphs universe, almost never is there any relationship to anything that you read in the books other than the fact that there's a Yeerk empire. And maybe, you know, the hierarchy works in that particular way, that there are visitors and whatever, that these particular alien races exist. We've created our own Yeerk rebellion, actually. We've created several different factions of the Yeerks. We've created different factions of humans and all sorts of things. So, you know, we've at this point created a self-sustaining or spiraling out of control universe. But I think what was powerful about that as early writers is you didn't have to be great at world building. You could still world build. Like we have these locations and their own systems and structures and hierarchies that we did have to world build. But at least like the technology was already there, at least the broader societal strokes were already there. It gave us constraints for a sandbox. So I think it's really powerful for that. If like me, you're a writer who really focuses on character. If, however, like I think I actually struggle still a bit with world building because it's something I haven't had as much practice with, because I've always sort of had that crutch to lean on, you know. So so I think that's like one of the pitfalls potentially of doing so much. It's not a pitfall, it's just something to watch out for if you start writing you know, your own unique stuff later on.
The flip side of that, I think, is we've often been complimented on the way that we write dialogue, and are just by the nature of the way in which we role play, it's text based and often on our phones. So it just is dialogue heavy. We don't spend a lot of time on heavy description. And so we've spent, you know, the better part of 12 years now practicing dialogue back and forth with each other. So that is an area where we feel like we have a lot of strength because of this like practice arena that is like so low bar. Like there's no way to get it wrong. No one is reading this other than the two of us, and it's never going to need to be edited.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of the things that I think you know, if I had to redesign my training regimen as a writer, I wish I had done more fan fiction, more stuff where I felt like I was totally free to just do anything at all. Because when I finally came back, I'll say, to writing, like I didn't do any writing in college. I just felt like I was overwhelmed and too busy with all the other things.
Same.
But after that, you know, when I said like, oh, I actually want to do this fairly seriously, I felt like I just said the word, right? Seriously.
Yeah.
Like I had to do this thing seriously right away. And I think that slowed down my learning process as a writer.
Yeah, it's amazing how much faster I can slap down some lines in whatever the current like random side Animorphs thing is with Jessi than I can on the serious novel I'm working on, because not just low bar, but it's just fun. like it's all fun. I do like writing seriously, but yeah, it's more playful, I guess. And that's very motivating and actually feels like a go-to. Whereas like if I've been writing my novel all day, like on a Saturday or something where I have the luxury to do that, I'm tired. You know, I kind of feel like I've worked a work day.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And it's still fun, you know, and that's it, it's nice to have the two versions, like the serious writing and the fun writing, because it means that neither ever really gets old, and it means that there's always kind of like a place where you can go to hone those skills. And also, it's been a really great way for us to problem solve. So we often do our role playing within that kind of pre-constructed world of Animorphs, but we've also had times where I'll be like, hey, Marie, my solo project is going nowhere right now. I am so lost. I don't know what to do. I don't understand this character. Can we just throw one of your characters and this character I'm trying to figure out into a bar somewhere and have them have a conversation? And that has been such a great way for me to actually figure out who I'm working with on my serious projects without having to just like sit there and stare at a blank screen.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, I love that idea. You hear things about like character interviews, or this even better, you know, conversation between two characters from different universes or whatever it may be.
And then of course I'm like, and then you can put it on your Patreon. Because
The
okay,
hustle mindset never sleeps.
well, okay, yes, and also like, you know, so at the time of this recording, it's been almost a week since you met me at a local bookstore, Neil, so that I could man a booth to sell some books. And you know, what do we, after printing costs and all of that, you know, we're making a few bucks basically on each title sold, and or on each book sold. And but the, you know, and so then you know, you do more events, you do more books, you just did the work of getting your book into some local bookstores. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you know, you're out there trying to sell your book, right? Because you've spent all this time and energy on it. It's a great story, you're confident in it, and the world deserves to read this. But Patreon, we only have a handful of patrons right now, but they are very kindly and generously giving us the same as, if not more, than we would be receiving for a book every month, right? And so what are we doing for them right now? Like, we're putting out something unpublished. So typically it's a short story, maybe it's a novel fragment, maybe it's a deleted scene from Unrelenting, or even the sequel. Like, you know, there's various things we're doing, but we put out like one thing a month, maybe somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000 words, and get paid more than we would get paid to sell the novel, right? And so I'm increasingly convinced, I guess, turning this to like a business of writing conversation just for a second at least, that like, you know, being able to have something like that to supplement is huge, because you know, I certainly can't produce novels as quickly as I could produce little pieces for them.
Yeah, and you know, I think there's an added benefit there for the patrons themselves, for the people who have decided to stick with us month after month, and that's that they get to see some of the fun stuff, the stuff that's unpolished. Because so often I feel like
polish it a little.
we polish it a little, but like overall, like it's not perfect. It's not ready for publication, and I think more people need to see the sort of messy middle of writing, because, you know, maybe someday we'll take something like that is on our Patreon, take it off, polish it up, and put it as part of something else, and they can see the polished version. And I think process is important for people to be exposed to. And I think people should also be exposed to the fact that it is okay to just write something because it's fun. And that's
experimental or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it's also totally good and okay to just read something because it's fun. And I think that I don't know. I was thinking about that a lot recently. I tweeted something in reference to the Pizza Hut Book It campaigns, or I don't know what, if they called it a campaign or whatever it was. But this was the thing where you had some like particular sheet of paper where you were writing down like what you'd read in the summer, and you'd bring it into a Pizza Hut and they'd give you one of those little personal pizzas. And while I think and judging by some smiles there, some other people probably have fond memories of that, it's also very like, oh, well, I'm reading so that I get pizza. I'm not reading because I enjoy reading.
Yeah.
I was really fortunate that I grew up in a church that was big enough that it had like its own library, and my mom for a few years volunteered in that library. And so she would put together like the fun summer reading campaigns, and also would bring me up there, when she'd be just cataloging things or anything that had been turned in, she just needed to like reshelve and process or whatever. So I just like, the library became my personal playground, and it wasn't just like religious books, it was all kinds of things. That's where I first read Lord of the Rings, I'm fairly sure. I did have a lot of exposure to just sort of like great children's classics there, children's poetry, lots of like Shel Silverstein happening. Yeah, and so I think for me, like reading always was just this delight, because as like a little introvert, it was perfect. I could just like make myself a little fort under the undersized children's tables and just hide under there with a flashlight and read for hours.
Yeah, I remember when I was a kid, my parents had to change how they punished me, because they would punish me to my bedroom and I'd just be like, okay, that's great. I just get to sit and read. And so they eventually had to like punish me to my bed because my bookshelf was all the way over there and I couldn't get to the books.
You were like, I'm going to Narnia, bye.
Like, it's fine. I read because I don't like people. I'm good with this. This allows me to avoid all the people.
I remember at some point I got called out by the teacher for reading Goosebumps books in math class, just like very obviously. Like I just had like, I just like had my eyes like way down, It was like super obvious. But and I should mention that I eventually majored in math. So it didn't turn out badly. But man, I was addicted to those things, and like,
Oh yeah.
I didn't finish it. Like we had reading period right before math. If I didn't finish the book, like what do you want me to do?
Mhm.
These books are like just slightly too long.
I know, right?
Period.
They're not that long. I could almost get through one of them.
Oh my gosh, have you seen the Goosebumps movie or movies maybe now? With like
No, and
Jack Black?
I also like hate horror. I actually really hate horror. I like, even as a
Okay, but
kid, like a lot of those Goosebumps books terrified me, and I
yeah.
don't know why. I don't know exactly what my mindset was, but like I devoured them. But then like I like couldn't be around the not marionettes, but the ones that like the ventriloquist dummies. I like couldn't be around them after reading one of those books, right? So like I don't know what exactly was going through my brain. And I hate horror. I don't do it. Like, yeah.
Yeah, I also was scared of horror as a kid and also loved those books. And it really wasn't until probably my late 20s that I kind of just like made this decision that I was like, I would like to learn to like horror. And so I just like started watching movies and I started reading, Stephen King or whatever. And yeah, now I love it. And I also have the luxury, however, of like almost never remembering my dreams. So I can kind of just like watch something and then it's like gone. I probably was terrified all night, but like I don't remember being terrified.
I'm very jealous of this skill. I still have Jurassic Park nightmares plaguing me.
Jurassic Park was terrifying.
Yes.
It was absolutely horrifying.
I watched it like 6 times in theaters. Still
I watched
terrifying.
it. I watched it. I had a I think I was 8 or 9 when it came out, and I had a crocheted blanket. So it had like all those holes in it because it was like a loose weave crochet. And I put it over my head and I would like watch through the little hole. Yeah, like that. I would watch through the little holes in the crochet and then like duck down. Horrifying.
I do actually still, if I'm like streaming something on my laptop, this is actually my preferred way of watching horror. I'll stream on my laptop because then when I know it's going to get scary, I'm like, it's too quiet. I know what's coming. And so I like minimize the screen down to the size of a postage stamp and then I'm just fine. I don't listen to my TV.
Meanwhile, I'm over here like, and I get nightmares. I remember all my dreams. I'm here like, okay, I'm watching horror. I have to turn all the lights off and put it on the big screen and turn the volume up because I don't know. I'm a massive.
Yeah, you're the bravest one of all of us, clearly.
Brave is not the word I would have chosen, but we'll go with it.
Well, that seems to be a slight lull in the conversation. I think we could, talk until we all dropped. But I think I'm gonna try and call it there. Yeah, I had no particular plan on how to wrap this up, but I'm really glad we did this. I thought that was an awesome conversation about just the writing processes, and then also I super duper enjoyed to digress into fan fiction and horror and reading and writing for fun and all that good stuff. So I'm going to plug your book, Marie Parks and Jessi Honard. Honard?
Yeah, you got it right.
Honard. Okay. Unrelenting. So yeah, there's supernatural thriller that they didn't know was a supernatural thriller at the beginning, with the very there we go. There, put it up on the screen with Bridget, who is headstrong and oh man, I can't think of like a good word. I'm not doing the words right now. I want to say pushy, but like that's exactly not what she like. That's what people are complaining about. But she is, right? Anyway,
she's the best kind of pushy.
She's the best kind of pushy. And she drives the story forward, and that's exactly what is I thought it was great about, especially the opening. So yeah, so pick that up, and then I'll put mine up. I don't have the fancy background, but here's mine. And yeah, do you guys have any closing words you want to say? Or
this book is phenomenal. Like I keep saying like you're the 2022 sci-fi debut author to look out for, and I mean it, because like it's just so it really does span a lot of wonderful emotions. The world building's excellent. The character interplay is so fun. And the character arcs are profound, and people need to read this book.
Yeah, agreed. 100%. Everything that she said, it is correct.
No, Jessi was like truly gushing to me about it.
I was.
Well, thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
It warms my heart for sure. So It was awesome to talk to you both. It was awesome to meet you, Jessi, in whatever this is, not in person, but it's more in person than other things. I don't know. Yeah, maybe we'll do this again sometime, or at least it's nice to put a face and a voice behind the name.
We'll do it again when you finish Animorphs.
Or yeah, it sounds like we need to do it sooner than that, but maybe that'll be
like the early 20s.
Yeah,
the early 20s of the book. Yeah. All right. Let's do that plan. I like that idea. We'll have an Animorphs dedicated session, so viewers can look forward to that. We'll get all the Animorphs fans checking out the channel.
I'm so excited.
Those books, there's 3 particular books there that I've only read once because they were that intense. So this will maybe be when I finally go reread them in preparation for that conversation.
Okay.
Heard yourself. Anyway, thanks for inviting us on, Neil. It's been a blast.
Absolutely. Okay.